And before we get into the meat and potatoes of our meeting this evening, I wanted to welcome everyone here in person at the Etobicoke Civic Center and those of us joining online. Thank you for taking the time out to learn about this important budget process that we are in the midst of as a city, and your input is important to us. And so today's about learning about the process. This is a first-time process for this kind of a budget with the new legislation that we are currently under. And so we have an expert with us today to walk us through that. And we will like to open the floor to hear from all of you. So before we dive in, I'd like to acknowledge the land that we have gathered on. The City of Toronto acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. And the city also acknowledges that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaties, signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. The City of Toronto has been acknowledging the traditional territory since March 2014. Due to conversations with Indigenous leaders, including the Aboriginal Advisory Committee as part of the 2018 Toronto for All campaign, the language the City of Toronto uses has evolved. So thanks again for being here with us tonight, and I'd like to hand it over to my colleague, Councillor Holyday, for opening remarks.
Thank you, Councillor Morley, and good evening to everybody. Thanks for coming tonight. This is a first for myself and Councillor Morley. I guess it's fitting, it's budget season, and we thought we would save some money by having a meeting together. Just kidding. It's important that we're working together in Etobicoke, and we did see this as an opportunity to get some information out to the community. It's the same information for both Councillor Morley and myself, but Etobicoke is a great place, and many of the issues don't stop at the border between Ward 2 and Ward 3. So, I think things that we're going to hear tonight is something that's shared between the two communities. As Councillor said, both of us actually have been around City Hall for some time in various capacities, but this is new. This budget is brought to us by the mayor. The mayor has brought forward a proposal. We're still working to understand all of the bits and pieces of it. That's part of the process before us. Mr. Conforti from staff is going to talk to us a little bit about some of the information and the little bits and pieces of the budget with a presentation, but then there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers. We're glad to answer them as best as we can, but also just to listen to see what's on your mind. Eventually, and I guess it's fitting, February 14th, it will go to council, and council will cast their votes on this. And both Councillor Morley and myself, although our politics are a little different, we'll be having to make some decisions on how we support the budget and the budget process as it works its way through. So thank you, and I look forward to a dialogue tonight and to hearing from people, both on maybe if they have some comments or even the questions that you ask help inform us to think about what's important. So I'll pass the microphone back over to our gracious host. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Holyday. Glad to be doing this in collaboration with you and with your office. And I just wanted to take a moment to thank all of our incredible teams and staff. Mike at the back, who's helping us with AV and keeping us all running, making sure those online are able to plug in and hear us and see us. And of course, to my fantastic staff who have helped with great outreach and getting the word out for tonight's opportunity. So just to be super clear on the format for this evening, and a few housekeeping rules. If you do need the washroom throughout the presentation, it's just on the way back out where you came. If you take a right, there's men and women's washrooms there. There are refreshments outside, but unfortunately they cannot come into the chamber. As if you would like a refreshment, please do help yourself, but please do not bring it into the chamber. And the other piece that we wanted to just share is we have about a 30-minute presentation. Stephen Conforti, who is Executive Director of our Financial Planning Division at the City of Toronto, is going to take us through sort of how this process has come about and what the budget looks like generally. We're going to open it up for Q&A to ourselves and, of course, to Stephen. But we do want to be really clear that today is more of an information session. And if you would like to weigh in specifically, there is going to be an opportunity to do that. I understand the opportunity to depute closed today if you wanted to speak in person, but you can still submit comments directly to the Budget Committee. We'll have more information at the close of our session on how to do that. And just a heads up, if anybody's unmuted, I'm not sure, but we can hear. feedback. Thank you so much. And with that being said, I will turn it over to Stephen Conforti from the City of Toronto.
Perfect. Thanks so much. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
All right, great. Before I get started, I'd like to thank Councillor Morley and Councillor Holyday for inviting me and hosting this, and their team for putting this together. And everybody that's attending, it's great to do this in person again. I haven't done this in person since 2020, which is just a great way to kind of get feedback from everyone that's involved, and it really helps shape the budget processes both this year and moving forward. So the presentation that we're about to give, so this is the same presentation that we gave to Budget Committee last Tuesday. It's our budget launch presentation. It probably took us about an hour and change to get through it all. I'm going to be giving a bit of an expedited version, but obviously if there's any questions, by all means, we happy to answer them as we get to the Q&A period. So if we can please go to the next slides. Perfect. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the city has an operating budget and a capital budget. Just to provide some context, the operating budget, which is $16.16 billion, allows us to provide the services and pay for our day-to-day expenses. We have a capital budget which spans 10 years, $49.26 billion. That allows us to acquire or renew the assets that we own in the city to be able to deliver those services. Our combined budgets are actually greater than most provinces. We're one of the largest budgets in the entire country, and it just speaks to the scale and scope of what we deliver here in the city. I'll talk about this in a bit, but this has been an incredibly challenging budget. I think any potential challenges that we could face, both on the operating and capital side, really had to be dealt with this year. That being said, we are tabling a balanced budget. And what that means is that our planned expenditures have to align with our expected revenues. Unlike the federal governments or provincial governments, a municipality is not able to bring forward a budget that is not balanced, essentially as a deficit, nor would we want to, because we don't have the revenue tools to actually support deficit budgeting. The budget does maintain frontline services and manages affordability, and it continues to make key investments in our priorities of transit, housing, public safety, and key infrastructure investments. Next slide, please. As we built the budget, we built it as we do every year in establishing, key principles and priorities. So this year, as we did that, we needed to ensure we were maintaining frontline services. We also had to ensure we were investing in emergency services and public safety. Transit continued to be a key priority in our budgeting, as well as transit obligations this year, especially with preparing for the opening of Eglinton Crosstown and the cost that comes with that. Housing continues to be a key priority from where we invest both operating and capital dollars. It was also important to invest in economic recovery, especially as we continue to manage the impacts of the pandemic. As I mentioned, managing affordability was highlighted, as well as continuing to address those COVID impacts that are continue to be impacted in our budget, and then really are expected to continue for a couple of years yet, if not beyond that. And then as well as managing legislative requirements that we have in our budget. Next slide. So I'd mentioned that, I've been involved in city budgets since 2006, and every year it's a challenge. There's always a challenge that we're dealing with in terms of trying to balance the budget. As we built this budget, I think the common theme amongst all of the staff in the city as we were preparing is it really was a bit of a perfect storm. Any challenge you could expect to have on both the operating budget or the capital, we were dealing with. So we continued to have the impacts of the pandemic. And I'll get into it in a little bit, but $933 million in impacts arising from the pandemic on our budget. Rising inflation impacts all of the services that we provide and the cost to deliver those services. Increased interest rates means it costs us more to be able to service our capital program. Supply chain disruptions, specialized labor shortages, competitive market, all of that also leads to cost escalation. Obligations associated with transit expansion. I had mentioned Eglinton Crosstown, growing demand for our services, and unanticipated legislative changes. So all of those happening concurrently, very unique, but not unique to Toronto, but being experienced in this year's budget. Next slide. This table just really quickly represents the COVID impacts that we've been facing since 2020. So in total, we've had about $5.5 billion in COVID impacts, predominantly in transit fare losses, added shelter costs, and added public health costs. We've been able to identify since that time $2.5 billion in city-led offsets through various mitigation strategies, And we've been fortunate to continue to partner with the federal and provincial government and receive $3.5 billion in funding. We still do need to receive about $484 million in funding from the federal or provincial government to offset 2022 impacts from the pandemic. And our budget was built assuming that continued support from the federal and provincial government, assuming $933 million in funding supports. I will get into strategies we have to put in place to ensure we have essentially a backstop in the event that those funds aren't forthcoming or adequate. But I'll get into that. And that is critical as well, because again, we have to maintain a balanced budget. So if not for that funding, we have to have other alternative strategies. Next slide. Again, continued prudent investments and renewed whole of government approach will help set the foundations for sustainable long-term recovery. For both this year and beyond, our response and recovery require continued funding for both the federal and provincial government towards those priorities we talked about: transit, housing, shelters, public health, recovery, climate action, and our infrastructure. Next slide. So I'll just quickly get into the operating budget. Next slide again, please. Again, we have an operating budget of about $16.2 billion. That, again, helps serve the day-to-day operations of running the city. If we go to the next slide. Just as a high-level overview, as we look at the operating budget that's been tabled, first and foremost, we were looking at managing affordability where possible, given all of the rising costs that we're seeing, focused on maintaining our core frontline services. It does include a 5.5% residential property tax increase. It also includes a 3% increase on our water rates and our solid waste rates. We have looked at opportunities, as we do every year, to find additional revenue opportunities. This year, we have our municipal accommodation tax, which is the tax you pay when you stay at a hotel. We're increasing that from 4% to 6%. There's also a 10-cent TTC fare increase that was approved by the TTC board a week ago, which is about a 3% increase. The budget responds to key pressures and priorities of emergency services and public safety, transit and housing, and economic recovery. And as I mentioned, it requires continued support from the federal and provincial government. We're looking for both governments to continue to provide supports to offset the COVID impacts that we're facing. Consistent with past years, we're also expecting continued support for the $97 million in costs that we incur for our refugee response actions, as well as $48 million from the province, again, consistent with the past experience in support of our supportive housing actions. And I'll get into both of those in a little bit. Next slide. Just really quickly, what this slide shows you is that even before the pandemic, it was always a challenge to balance the operating budget. We always had about $400 to $600 million in opening pressures as we start the budget process that we would need to find offsets or additional revenues to balance towards. What happened since 2020 is, on top of that, we were facing impacts of the pandemic. The good news is we are slowly seeing a decrease in the costs associated with the pandemic. But again, in 2023, we're facing other pressures. We're facing those inflationary pressures, growth demand pressures. What it all meant is, as we started this year's budget process, we had a $1.9 billion opening pressure that we had to offset. And just to add a bit of perspective, every 1% residential property tax increase generates $39 million. So you'd appreciate exactly what kind of property tax increase we would need to be able to fully offset that. Next slide. No different than I'm sure what everyone in this room is feeling right now. We are seeing economic impacts having an effect on our budget. Inflation. As we look at inflation for the Toronto census area, when we do a trailing average for the year, we have a 6.6% inflation rate. Cost of fuel, you can imagine the size of the city's fleet, especially our TTC fleet. For every 1 cent increase in the cost of fuel, that equates to about a $900,000 increase in our annual costs. Our budget this year, just for fuel, is going up by $46 million, which is greater than a 1% property tax increase on its own. Our food costs, no different than everyone else, are going up as well. When we look at our long-term care homes, raw food costs are going up by $3 million, or 31% increase. And then as well as interest rates. We had interest rates as low as 0.25% back in 2021. Right now, they're at 4.25%, which is the greatest that we've seen since 2008. And what that means is the cost to be able to support both the principal and interest repayments on our capital program is adding $65 million to this year's operating budget. Next slide, please. This slide identifies the impacts and the continued impacts of the pandemic. And really what's happening in the city of Toronto is we are feeling a disproportionate impact of the pandemic because of the size of our transit system and the size of our shelter services. So what you see here is 933 million, but it's predominantly within transit, 366 million. What that reflects is decreased ridership while we continue to provide that service. Pre-pandemic, we measure our ridership compared to pre-pandemic. And at the onset of the pandemic, we were as low as 20 to 25% of what our ridership had been prior to COVID-19. We've slowly been building that number up, but by the end of last year, we only got to 69%. So if you think of TTC generally, they would generate about 1.2 billion in revenue to offset about a $2 billion budget. We're about 30% off in terms of the amount of revenue that we can generate, but we're still providing that service. And that's the impact there. On the shelter side, that's the cost of ensuring that we're doing our part to help curb the spread of the pandemic and creating more spaces within our shelters. Public health, the city has led one of the greatest immunization efforts probably in the world. And you're seeing that in terms of not just the efforts that we've made, but also reflected in some of the costs. And that's 87 million. On the other side, and I'll get into this a little bit later, so maybe I can skip now, but we continue to have refugee response actions and supportive housing actions that we do expect continued support from the federal and provincial government on. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that when we started the budget, we had a $1.9 billion opening pressure. Again, we've been at this for probably about 6 months in terms of actions to try to bring that pressure down. What we've done, and it's not different than what we've done in the past years, is we separate our budget in really 3 buckets. We'll look at what we call our traditional base budget. So those are the costs of providing our services when we back out the impacts of the pandemic. Then we also, the second bucket is the impacts of COVID-19 itself. And then the third is for refugee response costs and supportive housing costs, which are really supports that we have in partnership with the federal and provincial government. So as we're looking at balancing this year's budget, we focus on those traditional base items. We were able to generate just under 500 million in additional revenue to offset that 786 million pressure. That's generated through property tax increase, the 5.5% that I had mentioned, as well as assessment growth, which is new development coming online in the city. We also have increased revenues. I'd mentioned the municipal accommodation tax. That 2% increase generated about 18.5 million in revenue. User fees are going up by inflation, about 4.5%. That's related to the costs specific to delivering that service. And with TTC fare increases, that's about 16 million revenue we've generated. The other piece is as we start to, as we continue to move along with the pandemic, where we're seeing the greatest recovery is actually in our corporate revenues. That's where we're seeing a lot of the return to some of the pre-pandemic levels. So that's helped us out as well. We've also had expenditure actions of just under 300 million. So that's the work that we do with all of our divisions and our agencies and reviewing their requests, reviewing their budgets, doing a line-by-line review, and ensuring the budget we put forward is consistent with what we actually expect to spend. There's also modernization efforts and procurement efforts that we've undertaken to try to find some savings. On the COVID side, we do expect continued support from the federal and provincial government of 933 million. In the event that that support's not forthcoming, since the start of the pandemic, we have set aside funds. We've set those funds aside that otherwise would have been directed to our capital program. In the event that we have to leverage those funds, we will, and we'll do that to ensure we can maintain a balanced budget. The caution there is once we use those, they're gone. And what that means is going forward, we no longer have that provision to be able to manage the expected continued impact of the pandemic. And we won't be able to ultimately redirect those funds to our capital program where they otherwise would have been used. Similar on the refugee response and the supportive housing, we do have a tax stabilization reserve. Again, if we had to use that reserve to fund these initiatives, it's not something that would be sustainable, and it's not something we could continue to do, and ultimately those services would be at risk. Next slide, please. I won't get into this in too much detail, provide a little more time for Q&As at the end, but this just highlights how our budget is broken down, where it's funded from, and where we spend. Next slide again, please. The other thing that's important to note is our budget on an annual basis invests in Extension's really a federal and provincial responsibilities. So 22% of our annual property tax base, or about $1.1 billion, goes towards housing initiatives like homelessness and housing first solutions, social services like childcare and youth development, and health services like infectious disease, family health. Again, that's 22% of our property taxes that go towards those services. And that's in addition to our significant capital investments that we make in those areas as well. Next slide. I spoke about the growing demand of our services, so I'll just get into a few examples. We know the housing crisis. We know, along with mental health challenges, that there's a disproportionate impact on major cities. Our shelter beds, we have more per capita than any other municipality in the country. Pre-pandemic, we had 6,000 shelter beds. Last year, that number grew to 8,500, and in this year's budget, we're providing 9,000 shelter beds. Next slide, please. We've also talked about our refugee response actions. So again, we have more dedicated bed for refugees than any other Canadian city. In about a year ago, we had about 500 shelter beds dedicated to refugee claimants. Sorry, I'm missing my dates. That was 2 years ago. A year ago, we had about 788 shelter beds dedicated to refugee claimants. This year, in this year's budget, we're providing 2,550 beds. That comes along with a cost of $97 million and represents 28% of all of our shelter beds. And again, we need to ensure we have timely funding supports from the federal government for us to continue to provide these critical supports. Next slide. We talked about supportive housing. What that is it's housing that we build, but it also includes wraparound services. And supportive housing is really a key component to ending chronic homelessness. So we have built, or will have built, 2,000 affordable housing units. There's about $48 million in cost to provide those wraparound services. And consistent with our experience in past years, we are expecting continued support from the provincial government associated with these costs. Next slide. On the TTC side, the budget this year includes a $53 million increase in tax support funding, coupled with about $16 million in additional revenue expected to be generated from a 10-cent fare increase. Those two increases combined allow us to prepare for the opening of Eglinton Crosstown and Finch West. It allows us to expand the Fare Pass program to ensure that we're open to 50,000 additional eligible individuals. It allows us to enhance our downtown station and streetcar route cleaning. We can add 50 additional special constables for safety measures, as well as 10 additional streets to homes workers in our transit system. It allows us to offset those increased fuel costs. And for TTC, that's about $36 million this year, just on added fuel costs. We're going to be looking at adding prioritized TTC service on routes within neighborhood improvement areas. And it allows us to freeze the fares on seniors, individuals in our Fare Pass program, as well as anyone that essentially has a monthly pass. Next slide, please. We're also looking at added investments within our emergency services. This year's budget provides for the first year of a 3-year plan to add new firefighters. And there's going to be 52 net new firefighters added to this year's plan as part of a 200 hiring class. It also allows us to have year 4 of 5 of new paramedics. We'll be adding 66 net new paramedics as part of a hiring class of up to 250. We're also looking at 200 uniformed frontline police officers, as well as a hiring strategy that includes 136 civilian officers that are going to help support in part 911 operations. It also includes 25 uniformed officers for our downtown core to enhance public safety. Next slide, please. And this just represents some key initiatives that we're making across the city. Again, focusing on delivery of core frontline services, promoting supply and safety of housing, investing in economic and downtown recovery, ensuring public safety, as well as maintaining affordability. Next slide. As we build any budget, an important piece is also understanding what do we expect the impacts to be in the following year. What are both the impacts that we're expecting, but also the impacts of the decisions that we're making today. So as we look ahead to 2024, we're expecting continued pressures of 1.5 to 1.7 billion. Better than the 1.9 that we had to face this year, but again, far beyond what we had traditionally seen, where it was about a 400 to 600 million opening pressure. And if you look, we continue to expect impacts from the pandemic at about 720 to about 930 million. We're getting to the point where the question really is, does this become the new norm? And are these pressures that we need to find a way to continue to incorporate into our budget going forward? Next slide, please. I'll quickly go through the property tax impacts. Next slide. We are recommending a 5.5% residential property tax increase. For multi-residential property classes, we're recommending half of that at 2.75. On commercial, again, half of that. That's consistent with provincial regulations. And we're recommending 5.5% on industrial. To the average home in Toronto, that's about $183 on your additional on your average property tax bill. Next slide, please. We also have our city building fund. Our city building fund was introduced a few years back. It allows us to generate funds that are leveraged to support our capital program and specifically to make critical investments in our transit and housing needs. We have about $6.1 billion in our capital budget that is supported through the city building fund. This includes a 1.5% annual increase that's planned for the next essentially 10 years. And that adds about $50 to the property tax bill this year as well. Next slide. I had mentioned 3% for solid waste and 3% for Toronto Water. On the solid waste side, that's about $29 to the average water bill. And on solid waste, it's dependent on the size of your bin, but it's anywhere from $5 to $16. Next slide. Again, this just runs down the average property tax bill of about $3,600 on an assessed property of just under $700,000. And it shows the breakdown of how those funds are directed. So just under $1,000 is directed to our emergency services of fire services, paramedics, and the police. Surprisingly, maybe to some, $658 goes towards really supporting our capital program, being able to support those investments, paying off the principal and interest payments on the debt that we incur. About $540 goes to transit. And then you see further down the list how different funds are allocated. Next slide, please. I'll quickly get into our capital program. The capital program, again, is how we invest in either acquiring or renewing assets to help support city services. Our 2023 capital budget is $4.45 billion. We also look at a 10-year capital plan. It's just under $50 billion, and it's actually the largest capital plan the city has ever had. It prioritizes, again, investments in transit, housing, as well as advancing the city's climate action goals. No different than operating. Again, I'd mentioned this a couple of times. Any challenge you could expect in this year's budget, we were facing. Significant increase in costs driven by supply chain disruptions, shortages in specialized labor, as well as that increased cost of borrowing. I had mentioned the rates we experienced of about 0.25% a couple of years ago, now to about 4.25%. That means more of our cost to service debt goes towards the interest payments rather than principal, which reduces our essentially our stretch, our length of being able to support capital initiatives. Our budget is supported by the extension of the City Building Fund, which helps mitigate against some of those challenges. We also leverage sustainable debenture programs. What that is really green bonds, where we issue bonds against some of our climate actions in our capital program. We've been able to get some of our greatest rates through those green bonds, and it helps mitigate against some of that higher cost of borrowing. We're also maximizing the use of development charges. So development charges, as a development is built, there's funds that are paid to the city, which we're then able to use for eligible capital projects that are built to support the growth in the city. That being said, there is an impact on the amount of DCs we collect as a result of Bill 23, which is provincial legislation, and I'll get into that a little bit later. It's also important to note that while the capital program is important for building the infrastructure we need, it's also important to the greater national economy, and it helps support job growth. Next slide, please. Again, I won't get into this in too much detail, but of the nearly $50 billion, this year shows how and where our investments are made. Just kind of the three big ones. Toronto Water is actually our largest capital investment, where we invest about $15 billion over the next 10 years to ensure we keep our infrastructure in a state of good repair. We're investing nearly 14 billion in transit, which actually doubles from what we had invested in transit just 4 or 5 years ago. The other key investment we make is in housing. So we have about 3.9 billion in direct investments to support housing initiatives in the city. We also have an additional 5.9 billion that we provide through incentives. So that might be fee waivers, land incentives, and again, that's all contributed to our housing programs here in the city. Next slide, please. I had mentioned that this is the largest capital program that we've had in the city's history. We have looked to add funds to our capital program in key areas. We've added 1.2 billion in mobility investments. So majority of that is within our transit system. We've added transit fleet, capacity enhancements for line 1 and line 2. We've also extended the 4-year bike share plan, or expanded that. We've also added $900 million on housing. That includes added investments for rental development, our Housing Now program, as well as TCHC development projects. There's about 700 million that was also added for flood protection and parkland. We've got additional funds for parks and community recreation facilities. We also have investments in key flood protection across the city. And then there's about 2.1 billion across other areas of the city. The majority of it is actually within our water and wastewater infrastructure. Next slide, please. Now, this slide speaks to our climate focus. One strategy we've undertaken in the city as we try to advance our climate goals is we look at how we can leverage our $50 billion capital plan to advance our climate goals. An example of that will be, as we look at an asset or infrastructure that we need to acquire or replace, we'll look at how we can leverage that. So zero emission TTC buses is a great example. We have a requirement to procure buses, but at the same time, if we can do it in a way that helps advance our climate goals, that's really something we're trying to integrate into the decision-making process as part of our capital plan. When we look at that $50 billion in capital, about $17.5 billion includes projects that have a component that support us advancing our climate goals. And we really look at those areas where we have our greatest emissions within our city assets. So we look at buildings and the ways that we invest in our buildings that reduce energy consumption or corporate emissions. Mobility and fleet. Again, I talked about the zero emission buses. We also have a sustainable City of Toronto fleet program. On water and waste, we have our wet weather resiliency program. We have erosion control initiatives in place. We also have landfill control and organic waste processing initiatives. Now, all of these look to either reduce GHG emissions, so about 4.2 billion in projects support GHG reductions. 5.4 supports climate resilience, and we've got about 8 billion that actually support both. Next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Thank you. When we look at our capital program, I've talked about those key priorities of climate initiatives, transit, housing. An overarching priority of our capital program is addressing our state of good repair. State of good repair is essentially, it's like it sounds. To ensure we're investing in our assets to ensure that they're maintained properly and they continue to provide the services that they need to provide. If we look at the capital program from nearly 10 years ago, we had about $16.6 billion invested in state of good repair. Today, we're investing nearly $25 billion. So that's almost a 50% increase in the amount of funds we direct to state of good repair. We've been able to do that because of the introduction of the City Building Fund directed to transit and allowing us to double our investment in transit. It's how we're going to leverage the vacant home tax and using the vacant home tax to advance a lot of our housing initiatives, including where we've added just a couple of years ago, $1.6 billion into our TCHC building repair to bring our housing stock into a state of good repair. We've added about $1 billion over the last 10 years to our fleet replacement, again, advancing our climate goals as we look at a green fleet program. And water and wastewater, which is really the best example of how we look at using our water rate increases and ensuring they're directed to our capital program to ensure we're advancing that infrastructure repair requirement. Next slide, please. Now, so while it continues to be a priority and 24.2 billion or nearly 50% of our capital plan goes to state of good repair, the challenge that we're facing is that our state of good repair has been negatively impacted by the pandemic. So we've always had to deal with aging infrastructure. A lot of our infrastructure was built in the 60s and 70s, and it requires significant investments. But at the same time, we're seeing the impact of where we've had to pause capital spending to ensure we had funds set aside in the event of COVID funding shortfalls. We have the supply chain issues and cost escalation, which are all both leading to increased costs, as well as specialized labor shortages, which is delaying how fast we can move on those projects. And I've talked about the increased cost of borrowing. All of this, and despite the level of investment that we're making in state of good repair, means we currently have a backlog of about $9.5 billion that we expect to grow to $18.8 billion by 2032. And when we look at what is going to be the greatest impact, it's going to be in transit, our road network, our recreation facilities, and our city buildings. The extension of the city building fund will help mitigate those impacts on our transit and to a lesser extent, our housing portfolio. We're also looking at continuing to enhance our asset management planning, which really directs how and where we apply our funds for best use. But we're also committed to coming back as part of the 2024 budget process with a strategy that's going to look at ways for us to increase our SOGR investments and ultimately reduce that expected growth in that backlog. And that's going to be critical for next year's budget. Next slide, please. I talked about Bill 23 quickly, and again, the impacts it has on city's capital funding. So just to take it even a bit step back, I'd mentioned the city collects development charge revenue through development that happens in the city. We leverage that, and it's really restrictive in how we can use it, but we leverage it to support the infrastructure we have to build to support that added development, that added growth and density in the city. Bill 23 was announced late last year with the intention of increasing affordable housing. The challenge is that it has a direct negative impact on the city's ability to deliver our housing TO plan. So when we look at that, what happens is it reduces the amount of development charges that the city can collect. What we expect is over the next 10 years, we will lose $2.3 billion in development charge revenue that we would have been able to direct to our capital program. When we look at that further, just because of the size of the services that we benefit from, about 93% or $1.9 billion of that will impact our housing programs, our transit programs, roads, water, parks, and recreation. And if you dig even a little bit deeper, 1.3 billion of that, or 57%, will reduce the funds we have available to deliver our housing TO plan. Our budget has been built based on the assumption that we will be reimbursed from the province for that funding loss, and that's consistent with an assurance that we've received from the province. That being said, if we are unsuccessful in receiving that reimbursement, we'll be okay for 2023 because the nature of development charges, we collect it and then we'll spend it in the following year. But we will be challenged in 2024, and we'd be forced to come back with a capital budget in 2024 where we significantly reduce our investments in those key areas. Next slide, please. So that's it on the budget. This is really just a summary slide. I've talked about it, so I probably don't need to get into it again. We'll jump to the next slide, and it just talks about where we are in the process. We launched the budget last week on the 10th. We've had an opportunity to hear from all of the city divisions and agencies on the 12th and 13th. Deputations happen tomorrow and Wednesday across the city, and again, in person for the first time since the pandemic. And then ultimately, the mayor will table his proposed budget on February 1st after he's able to get all of that feedback. And council will be considering the budget on February 14th. So I think that's it for me. Can you turn it back over to you?
Amazing. Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm sure you could probably give this presentation like in your sleep at this point. It's been an incredible amount of work. And as was mentioned by Stephen, this is something that the staff are already in the process well in advance of it coming, of course, to council. And so we really appreciate all of the hard work. It's a massive budget, as you've heard, and a lot of different components that go into it. And so our interest here today was really just to share this information with you all in terms of how the budget came together, what the various considerations and pressures are as it relates to this budget, both for 2023 as well as the 10-year capital project or program rather, and as well as how we are currently trying to navigate some of the new legislation that we are under the purview of as it relates to the provincial government and some of the new bills, including Bill 23 and its direct impact on the city. So we're opening the floor at this point. I know there are some folks joining online. I'd like to introduce my colleague Chesley, who works in my office, who's going to help moderate a bit of the Q&A. I think we have a microphone that can go around in the audience, and so that is going to be right up at the podium. And we are here. We're available to answer questions that you might have specific to the process as it relates to this budget, and frankly, any comments or concerns that you'd like to share. I would like to remind folks that the budget considerations by the committee and the mayor are ongoing. Those deputations are taking place the 17th and 18th, and we do encourage folks to share their feedback directly with the mayor and with council and with the budget committee, so that can be taken under consideration before the final budget is tabled. Again, I'm new here, so I don't know how much change is frankly quite possible between now and February 1st, but I know many of my colleagues and I are really trying to dig into the budget and compare that with what we're hearing from residents in terms of your needs and concerns, and advocating and sort of sharing those suggestions forward with hopes that some changes are possible where appropriate. And so this is an opportunity for you to ask us any questions. We're happy to open the floor.
And so just with that said, right, just to do this in an orderly way, it's a bit funny because we're in a hybrid situation here. So I think the way that we'll do it, create an opportunity for folks, if folks can hear me okay, for folks to, if you have a question, please feel free to walk up to the microphone, right? There's also, if you have issues with mobility, there is, Ashley's at the back, she does have a microphone. And the way that we'll order this, we'll take one person from the podium, and for folks online, if you can either raise your hand or indicate your question in the chat, and we will go from podium to online, podium to online, if that is fair, I think. And we have about 30 minutes or so, 25 minutes or so to do this.
I'm going to make a suggestion, Chelsea, from my colleague here, Councillor Holyday, just in terms of the ratio of numbers. We do have a larger group in the room, so maybe we can do 2 in the room and 1 online and go from there. Perfect. Thank you.
All right, sir.
Thanks very much. My name is Noel Semple, and thank you so much for your service and for this fascinating presentation tonight. My question is about the police budget, which is one of the hot button issues. It seems like one of the big kind of discretionary decisions being made is to increase the budget for the police by $50 million. And I mean, I know people who have been victims of violent crime, and it's just devastating to someone's life. And I think if $50 million would prevent 1,000 violent crimes, it would be a small price to pay. But my question for you is, how many violent crimes will be prevented, and how can we know? Because it's a lot of money and there's a lot of unmet needs out there.
That's a great question, Noel. Thank you so much for raising that. It is, I think, one that it's going to be a little bit tricky for us because we are not obviously the heads of the various divisions. We had heard from the Toronto Police Services who participated at budget recently, but I can certainly give you my sense of it and obviously open the floor to my colleagues. My understanding of the additional funds that are being directed to the police are not necessarily to address violent crimes. It's more to address the response times, which we have heard are significant and lagging, and the police have requested more resources in order to close that gap and be able to respond to folks in a more immediate fashion. And the other piece was around enhancements in neighborhood officer programs, as I understand it. And so they have a little bit of a different focus than the general a police officer would. And they go in groups, they are assigned to specific neighborhoods, and they're there for longer periods of time with the hope that they can build long-term relationships and deeper relationships with those various communities. So that's my sense of the reasoning behind those additional dollars. And I can't speak to how that will address violent crime. I think those of us who appreciate sort of social determinants of health and the need for wraparound supports in community understand that that is something that we need to be preventative about wherever possible. And of course, we need a strong police force to respond when that comes up. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you again for the question. An important topic because it's, I think it's something that any councillor hears about politically, and you read about it in the newspaper every day. Couple factors. I really hope the Police Services Board uses that money to go directly to hire officers. I've heard the number 200 put around in the media. I can't say for sure that that's what it's going to be because they operate independently of council. But I think you know, there is support to give them additional money. But think about this: the police budget is largely human resources, right? It pays for the staff salaries, small amount of money to do the operations. The city has grown over the last number of years. The demands are up. So even just on the plain face of more population coming into the neighborhood, having the additional officers to serve the larger population, I think is an expectation of the public, and it goes for good planning. In addition, if you bring new frontline officers in there, you can answer some of the Auditor General's reviews of direct frontline services in relation to 911. We know there was some reporting on that and the response times. And in addition, you free the more experienced officers to move up into the ranks to work on the various projects that they may be interested in and the types of different things that the police do beyond the front line. And of course, violent crimes are a complex thing. They could be anything from something that's related to an organized crime or a larger systemic issue to just the simple deterrence factor of somebody making a crime of opportunity. And that's where you've got the frontline presence and at least the perception of a frontline presence that helps with that. And at the end of the day, if people are feeling safer in our community, that makes me happy as well because I'm a community member as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is John Nunziata. I was an elected official for 20 years, an alderman and then a member of parliament. And I'm very concerned about the lack of democracy now at all three levels of government. And 29% of people in Ontario just voted. And I'm very concerned about Progress Toronto. And I'm going to ask Councillor Morley, you seem to follow their instructions. And for example, two subjects. Changing the name of Dundas. Do you support changing the name of Dundas? Yes or no?
So I'm going to keep us focused on the topic at hand. That is not the topic at hand. And respectfully, John, we have had an offline conversation. I asked you to contact my office to set up a meeting for us to have a conversation specifically about this topic, but I'm not going to get into it today. We're here to talk about the budget.
Well, you should know because the cost will be anywhere from $10 to $15 million. And that's ridiculous because my sister voted against changing the name of Dundas, and the lefties, Progress Toronto, calls her a racist. And she said, instead of spending 10 or 15 million dollars to change the name, that's not very wise. Give that money to Spider Jones. Do you know what Spider Jones does?
I'm sure. Sorry, do you want to? I think we're getting a little bit off topic, John, and
No, it's
respectfully,
not.
there are people who came
With
here to
respect,
discuss
it's
the
not
budget.
off topic. You have a responsibility to represent your constituents, not
Correct.
some left-wing organization.
I'm not here on behalf of anyone.
Have you reached out to your constituents to ask how they feel about changing? Because I know for a fact that the overwhelming majority of residents in Etobicoke Lakeshore and probably right across the city are very upset about that proposal.
Mhm.
And Spider Jones has an organization, Believe to Achieve,
Mhm.
where he wants to help those young boys in particular
Mhm.
so that prevent them from joining gangs and becoming involved in. Do you two councillors know how many murders there were in Toronto last year?
Sorry, I'm going to.
I'm going to jump in.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I just?
Yeah. So yeah, I think, John, obviously you have some concerns and some things you'd like to discuss. And we've got about 30 people online and another 50
No, but
people or
you're
so
here to
here to
hear
talk
from,
about
you're
the
here to hear
budget.
from the public. So I'd like to know your.
I'm available to you and
Okay.
I have encouraged you to reach
Okay,
out to me
the
directly.
Police
from-
Services Board is recommending increasing the budget.
Right,
The mayor supports that. and
Right.
There's a number of councillors. Can you tell us whether you will support that proposal to increase the police budget? Well, you told me that you don't. In fact, your organization that you support wants to defund the police. So will you support the increase in the police budget? Yes or no? That's my question.
thank you for your question, John. Thank you for coming out here today. I am in the process of understanding what the budget is before us, and I'm working with my colleagues to get the best outcomes for Torontonians. So when the budget comes forward, the final budget on February 1st, when that comes forward, we'll be able to see that line by line, and you'll see where I vote. Thanks, John. No problem. I'm happy to chat with you offline some more. And we're going to continue with questions. Thank you to the next person at the podium, but I think we're going to go to someone online.
Thank you, Amber.
All right, so I'm just going to read the questions in the order they came in. And we're going to focus on the questions first as opposed to comments. So the first question is actually from Tim Ellis, and he says, if reduced transit ridership from the pandemic is a challenge, why is restoring mask requirements on public transit not an option? I would return to public transit if it could be made safer through mask protections.
So thank you for the question, Tim, and thank you for participating. What I know from my time working in vaccine engagement is a lot of the specific mandates around masking often come from our Ministry of Health and from the province. And so many times we as a city are working to fall in lockstep with the provincial direction. And so when those mandates were dropped provincially, I think you will have seen us go from mandatory to recommended on the TTC. And I super appreciate the concern. And I'll just hand over to my colleague, Councillor Holyday, for some more on that.
Yeah, the advice remains to wear a mask as far as I've ever seen. I wore mine today. I would say 10 to 25% people wear it based on the vehicle. But I get the question. I'm not sure that there is the public health data that would back a solid mask mandate if we're not seeing it at other levels. But it comes down to personal choice, and I wear mine, and I would recommend it if anybody else wants to go on the TTC, wear yours.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question about something I don't quite fully understand, and that's the impact of the new strong mayor powers on how the budget is presented and tabled. So wondering if you can provide maybe a brief overview of how that would have happened in the past before the strong mayor powers came into effect, and how it happens now, how it went about in this particular budget, and what the major implications might be for the citizens of Toronto. Thank you.
Sure, I can start, and by all means, if either of you want to jump in. So if we look at last year's budget, we would have presented, so it would have been a staff recommended budget. So staff would have built the budget, we would have provided a recommendation to budget committee. Budget committee would, similar to the process we're seeing now, they would hear from staff, they would get questions of all the different divisions and agencies. Then they would basically make a recommendation on that budget, and they would own it. Then it would bring it to executive committee. Executive committee would do the same thing. They would bring it to council, and then ultimately it would be voted on at city council. What's different with the strong mayor powers, there's a lot of little complications, and trust me, I'm talking with clerks and legal almost on a daily basis of understanding all of it. Components of the budget now fall under the mayor's proposed budget. Not all of it, but aspects of it. What happens is staff are tabling a budget, not much different than we did in the past. We have continued to engage with the mayor's office, but we would always have engaged with the mayor's office even in the past. We did get some directions from the mayor later in the process in terms of things where he'd like us to see to make some key investments. But again, it was more kind of at the higher level in terms of some key investments. From there, we now table a budget to budget committee. It's not that staff are recommending it. Budget committee reviews and will ultimately make recommendations to the mayor. The mayor is going to take what staff have tabled. He's going to take the recommendations that have come from budget committee. He's going to take what he hears from deputations, and he's going to propose a budget on February 1st. That budget will then be considered by council. There's a little bit of a difference in terms of when it gets to council. In the past, the budget itself would have been voted on by all of council. Now what happens is councillors can move an amendment, and it's an amendment that would ultimately get voted on rather than the budget itself. There's some other changes whereby if an amendment ultimately is passed, the mayor does have a veto right that he could exercise 14 days after that amendment. Council can challenge that veto, and they would need, I believe it's a 2/3 vote to challenge. So a lot of little minutia and details, but that's kind of at a high level, the major change in the process.
I think I would add, this will be the ninth budget I've gone through, and frankly, we're still learning as the process unfolds because it is brand new. And I'm not saying it's radical learning, but there are these nuances as you've been talking about. I think the key takeaway is that a political lens through the mayor's office has been applied, through the mayor, has been applied to the first pass of the budget, as opposed to the more traditional council process that you see, say with a planning report or a piece of public policy. There's often a staff report that is independent public service advice. So the very first pass, the percentage tax increase, some of the things that were presented today as enhancements or big policy pieces of the budget comes from the hand of the mayor. And it's not drawn on a napkin by any sense, probably with tremendous advice from the public service. And that is the starting point, is the first starting point. And then it will go through other political lenses that are somewhat unique. As far as I understand, the mayor has directed that it would follow something closer to the traditional process where the budget committee would look at this and make recommendations. And ultimately, as it always does, is it goes to council for consideration. And as Mr. Conforti pointed out, there are some nuances in the legislation that a mayor may elect to use a veto power on. But that is untested, brand new. We're learning that as we go along, and we don't even know if we will see that. But it's something to consider if you're a councillor moving an amendment that may be a little radical. You always have to keep in the back of your mind that you have to be collaborative to make sure that it passes. Hopefully that's helpful.
Councillors Holyday and Morley, thank you for your service, first of all. My name is Brian McIntosh. I'm the chair of the Central Etobicoke Community Hub Initiative, as I think most of you know. And we serve the residents and community agencies and associations who are looking for the development of community spaces for critical and urgent, in many cases, services and programs in our area. There is no hub or health center in Central Etobicoke, and it's urgently needed. I have a submission that I will share in writing with both of you and Mr. Conforti. But my question, I guess, is that we're hoping that the city will recommit to the budget, to the council decisions that were made in November of 2020 with regard to the potential use of this building for a portion of the space once the 6 Points development is in place. And so for that matter, I guess I'm suggesting that maybe we can make a recommitment to that in the city through the capital budget that's being proposed, the 10-year capital budget. And there will be a need for some capital costs, obviously. We're also aware, though, that there have been an increased need of services. And many, this is maybe 7 or 8 years down the road to use this spot. So we're looking at and hearing from our partner agencies and so on that there's an increased demand for programs and services. And in that time frame, there's going to be an even more increased demand. We learned from the last census that there's more youth, marginalized youth in our community, more seniors, even though this is a high senior population in Central Etobicoke. So we're hoping that we might be able to direct a little more funding for the continuing community collaboration with and between agencies at different levels of government in order to identify and procure equitable, accessible, and affordable community spaces for social, cultural, health, recreational sector agencies to deliver much needed essential programs. And lastly, to say that was done through the vaccine engagement process, which was very successful in the city of Toronto and didn't cost the city a ton of money and enabled the kind of collaboration across the agencies that we're looking at, hoping to expand. So because we all know that agencies that cooperate together know about their own needs and the needs of others, and they can be more responsive to the needs of individuals. Lastly, it is come time a long time ago to remove the barriers that exist for community agencies and nonprofits who seek to secure spaces for programming and services, such as exist as barriers for spaces in schools or in other publicly owned and operated facilities, including libraries. There are other things in my submission. I don't have a particular question, but I just wanted to keep those issues before you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your service, Brian. And thank you for bringing those very important pieces to our attention. As you know, both Councillor Holyday and I are deeply engaged with some of the groups that you mentioned, and certainly I think are very much in alignment with the priorities to provide the kind of resources and spaces. So I hope you will keep us engaged, and you do have my commitment to that ongoing support. Councillor Holyday would like to comment as well.
You stole the words about thanking for Mr. McIntosh for your service. Folks should know, I mean, there are advocacy groups, including the Hub Initiative, that are working for change. And as so was eloquently said, you know, there is a need for support. It comes down to geography, and that's one of the things about the community that we live in Etobicoke. It is sort of spacious, right? There's a little room to breathe. It's not deeply urban, but with that, you know, you have to travel farther to get services, and there are maps out there that show the gaps. So there is a lot of talk about finding new access points for people, because you tend to get more access to the service when it's a little closer. You don't have to take 5 buses to get there. Perhaps the one, you know, and I'm very excited about that, continue on that path. And there's some good public policy that's emerged from City Hall. I'm straying a little from the budget, but there's some good thinking. I would point out one risk, and it was touched on today's presentation, Bill 23. You know, everyone likes to talk about housing, but one of the targets for the City of Toronto is to hit the throttle. And if I recall the number, it's 280,000 homes over the next 10 years. And that represents a 115% growth in what was otherwise planned to be built over the next 10 years. And that's sort of the pace that you're seeing around us. So people have different approaches to development in our city. I hear my fair share of it in public meetings. But if you think it was busy then, wait till you see what's going to happen over the next 10 years. So the point is well made. There are needs now and there are gaps. I expect with an explosion of population, those gaps will become amplified. Juxtapose that to what we heard in the presentation around uncertainty, because one of the things the provincial government did was, you know, to create more housing, make it cheaper to build. And in a roundabout way, they reduced the financial burdens that developers pay to the city to be able to build the properties. But guess what? Those financial burdens were used to create fire stations, hire more police to, sorry, I should be correct, you know, build more infrastructure like police stations, more water infrastructure parks, those kinds of things to feed that development. And, you know, one of the things we would look at is where's the Civic Center and all of that mix. So when there's uncertainty in those financial numbers, you get to worry, and we have questions and they're not fully resolved as to where all of that will be made whole. You know, it could fall right on the taxpayer's shoulders. It could fall into a whole bunch of models, but there is risk in the air. And I think that was alluded to in the presentation from today, and it's big dollars. So something to think about. And, you know, everyone has a different thought about what the future is for growth in our city, but that's an implication that we need to be mindful of. Thank you.
So just before we get to the mic, we're going to go online and we'll come back to you.
Robert A. Gullins asks, Toronto community housing has been underfunded for decades, resulting in billions of dollars repairs and upgrades required. There are residents already living in these buildings. Now it appears we are giving priority to new housing for new residents rather than support this existing residents. Why?
Thank you for the question. I know there are some dollars earmarked in the budget for Toronto community housing, and Mr. Conforti, I wonder if I could pitch you just to highlight what that looks like. Yeah, there is a slide for it, but that'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, and just at a high level, so where we've made priority investments over the last couple of years has been housing and transit. And specifically in housing, we added $1.6 billion to be able to conduct our repairs of our TCHC housing stock. And in addition to that 1.6 billion, that allowed us to leverage 1.3 billion in co-investment from the federal government. And after that, we actually continue to work with them. So we have a 10-year plan. Every time we've added a new 10th year, we've added an additional 150 to 160 million. Then also on the operating side, we continue to increase the subsidy that we provide to TCHC. So it definitely has been an area where we've added more funds, and it's been a focus on our investments.
Thank you, Mr. Conforti. And I think that's something also that we as councillors, we need to pay close attention to. The Toronto Community Housing Board of Directors is also a venue that you can connect with to raise any concerns and look for accountability, frankly. Yeah, please, Councillor Holyday.
I'm struggling to find the slides, so I'm going to go by memory. So please forgive me if I don't have the precise numbers. But of the 600 million or so per year put towards housing, about 280 million is the operating subsidy. Does that sound 295? Pretty good by memory. 295 is the operating subsidy gone to Toronto Community Housing. So it is a very large piece of the budget. But there's an observation in that question that is important to note, and that is just public policy. So yes, there has been growth in housing. The growth has been in the mode of affordable housing, which is a different kind of subsidy. And it's a thin subsidy band as opposed to a deep subsidy band that you would typically find in Toronto Community Housing. So it's a little bit of a different type of housing. And that is where the city's strategic housing plan has taken us. And that's where I think you're going to continue to see growth in it. It's also not always cash. It was referred to in the slides as, foregone revenue is the technical term. So whether it was an extra piece of land that the city might have sold, or if it's development charges that it would have collected otherwise that would have gone towards keeping taxes low or whatever, that's put towards in a roundabout way to those housing subsidies. So it's not that there's no housing work going on, it's just another type that's going on.
So I'm just going to make a note. We have got just under 20 minutes left. We've got about 6 folks in front of us to ask questions in person, and I'm sure another few online. So I will commit myself to try to keep my responses brief as possible, and I'll encourage my colleagues as well. We love this stuff, so obviously we could talk about it all night, but please feel free to ask your next question.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Rojina Asrani. I live in the Mimico area, and I'm the president of the Mimico Residents Association. And one of the things we've done is reach out to our membership, ask for feedback around key priorities, areas of concern, etc. And we've compiled that along with, recurring comments that we receive as part of kind of the Mimico community feedback. I will save that for the budget committee that we'll be speaking at on Wednesday. I understand this isn't the right forum for that, so I'll just keep it to a multi-part question, but I'll be quick, I promise. The first question I have is about the revenue shortfalls. I've been hearing loud and clear that this budget depends on the province and the federal government to make up some of these shortfalls. I guess my first question is, what sort of guarantees do we have that they will in fact do that? I'm asking that because some of those important capital projects that are at risk seem to be pretty important ones, 40,000 housing units, maintaining our strained infrastructure. So first question is, what guarantees do we have that they're going to make up that shortfall? And has the city seriously considered other revenue tools, maybe ones that don't rely on or don't put the burden on working Torontonians, like commercial levies or things like that, especially if corporate revenues are recovering nicely? Have we seriously looked into that? And then last question really quickly, going back to the feedback we hear from the Mimico community, it's a very rapidly growing community. There is so much development in the area, particularly condo developments. We can't keep track of how many there are, which is great, but there is concern that the infrastructure and amenities in the community aren't keeping up with how quickly the population is growing, specifically when it comes to transit. Traffic congestion in the area is getting really bad. And we're not expanding transit options in that area. We're not expanding the cycling infrastructure. And so I don't hear that being a top focus in the budget. So we just ask that you comment on that. Thank you.
I'll jump into this quickly. Thank you so much for your service as a president in Mimico, and I know the community very well. Just a couple of things, and I know Mr. Conforti can speak more specifically to the commitment that the province has given as it relates to that aspect of it. With transit and some of the other concerns that you're mentioning about the growing community and the need for infrastructure to keep up, this is also a huge area of concern for me as well. We heard it loud and clear knocking on the doors, and as residents, myself and most of my team, we experience many of the challenges, including bottlenecking, at Humber Bay Shores with transit trying to get into downtown, and just sort of the degradation of accessible services, unfortunately, over the years. And so it is a major concern, the lack of our ability to get development charges to pay for that critical infrastructure. I don't have a clear answer at this point. And again, as Councillor Holyday mentioned about some of these processes and these new bills, we're learning, and it is a learning curve for many of us. I can just say that I've been directly in touch with TTC and working to advocate on getting the streetcars back on the tracks. We'll have some announcements about that timing very soon. There's also another GO station earmarked for the Humber Bay Shores community, just beside you in Mimico, for the Park Lawn GO station, which is also being negotiated to happen prior to the majority of the additional development that's going to come there, because we know that the residents there now need to be able to move through the community. So those are just some of the quick pieces that I can speak to, and I would open the floor to either of my colleagues if they have comments.
Yeah, I'll add a little bit. There is one piece there about intergovernmental relations, and that really is solely the job of the mayor, and I know he works really hard at it. I mean, he is the head of this council, and his job is to interface with the federal and provincial government. So those talks go on, and they go on vigorously and with a strong case. A couple things to think about. I mean, we are a really big city. We have specific needs. I think, and I'm sorry, I'm looking to Mr. Conforti to remind me, there's a specific ask just on refugees, 97 million. So, we would probably take a larger proportion of refugees that come to Canada because we're the largest city. So people are going to come here looking for opportunities. But we don't get any special funding. So, that's a great discussion in addition to COVID that the mayor will take to the provincial and the federal government to say, can you help us? Because, we're an economic engine. We want to be successful. In terms of the budget, well, there are no guarantees, though. There's nothing any councillor can do to ensure that other governments give us money. We hope you think about it when you go to the polls next time and cast your vote for governments, right? And I say that honestly, whoever you vote for, right? This is part of the work that they do to help us in the large cities. But there's no guarantees. And so there are contingency plans that are built into this budget, and some of them are very dramatic. And that means, slowdown of work, pave less roads, build less things, let the paint get a little more flaky on the walls. That's sort of an easy example, but it's a little more sophisticated than that. But, you have to, if you don't have the money, you can't build it. And the last thing I would say, and again, this is a bit of my politics, I'd be careful with revenue tools. There's no free lunch. People ultimately will pay taxes. So I know, kicked around in the media, some people have been talking about taxing parking lots and shopping centers as this magic solution. Well, imagine you start taxing the parking lots of the strip plazas in Etobicoke or, Sherway. Well, who do you think is going to pay for that? Well, the corporations are just going to throw out millions of dollars because we asked for it. It's going to be passed on to the shoppers. It might even be passed on to the small businesses that operate. And it might end up being less employment or less financial opportunity. So there's no free lunch at the end of the day. My personal take on this thing is I'm a bit of a tax purist. I like the city of Toronto to flow through the property taxes so that you can judge us. There's 7% on the board there today. I don't know how you feel about that. I know some people have been calling me about that, and they've got some strong opinions on it, but that's a lot of money. And you will judge me, and rightfully so, on what you're taxed on your tax bill and what you get for it. So I like that money to be front and center as opposed to be decentralized, but I appreciate the comments because, you know, there's a lot of money on the table. It requires a lot of money to run a big city, and it requires even more money to meet everyone's expectations on it. So hopefully that helps a little bit.
Yeah, I think it does. And I think Terry is our next one up to the mic, if I'm not mistaken, if my memory serves. Maybe I'm getting the name wrong. I apologize. But the one last thing, and this is sort of my politics, there are conversations happening amongst some of the newbie councillors, especially around revenue tools. And we are going to try to introduce that conversation. But we're trying to do our due diligence to understand what the impacts and implications of those potential revenue tools are. And again, ultimately, it's no one councillor's decision. It will be a decision of the mayor and council. But we understand, and Mr. Conforti spoke about a perfect storm. When we now layer on climate crisis, affordability, homelessness, like it is a perfect storm, and someone is going to have to pay the bill, but we also have to decide what kind of future we want. So those are conversations that are ongoing, and I'm sure you'll hear more about that in the coming weeks and days. Sir, please come on up with your question. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Terry Vango. I've been living in Etobicoke for 55 years. I've done volunteering for 40 years. I know both of you, but I'll. So I'm here because there's 2 points I want to say. One is that it seems like you're always asking for more money, more money, more money, and it's their money, our money here. But you haven't explained to us the benefits of each, happening. Some projects have to be accounted for. Some are probably out of date. But nobody seems to come back and say, oh, my goodness, it's a lot of benefits in this budget. We have to increase it, continue. But it's another budget project which is not beneficial, and you don't stop it. So your budget keeps on growing, and you're just going to make everybody poor in here. So I'm saying for accountability. This is accountability. You're now taking our money, but you're not making it accountable to us. Is it the right project? Is it beneficial? That's my question. I know you can't answer it, but this is what we should all know about. Transparency from you to us, so we can say, okay, we pay high taxes, but we're getting something for it. But I really don't see any transparency or any kind of way of allocating, reviewing the project after 3 years and see how it's working out or not. Some projects don't work, some may work. Anyway, I'm repeating myself. Number one. Number two, Mr. Holyday, when are we going to get another police station over north of Eglinton? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Terry. We appreciate your thoughts and your participation here. We definitely take them. Transparency and accountability are so important. Great to see you too. Thank you.
So spoken like a Ward 2 constituent, and like many people I've spoken to, right? You know, what's in it for us? We live here in this community.
Speak a little up.
What's in it for us? Our community, right?
Exactly.
And it's the same question that's on everybody's mind. I admit, and I've said this already publicly on radio and stuff, you know, I'm really struggling with a 7%, you know, endorsing a 7% increase. I haven't put my heart into that. What I would say, though, of the silver linings in this, there are some meaningful investments in emergency services. You're seeing a lot of money towards the police, and that's something I've not seen in a long time, but also fire and EMS. That's important to us in our community, for sure. For sure. And maybe one other element, because I sit on the TTC, that's a new job that I have in this council term, and we process the budget. The TTC raised fares 10 cents, but they also took from the taxpayers to help subsidize the operation of the TTC. But what nobody talks about, though, is that the ridership level is what it was in the 80s. It's gone down so low right now. So, you know, how do you keep that thing working and floating? Yes, there were trim backs on the levels of service. There was an injection of money from the taxpayers, and there's also an injection of money from the riders to make it all happen. And I think if you ask the taxpayers, should the riders pay some money? The answer is yes. And if you ask the riders, should the taxpayers help because it's good for the city? The answer is yes. So how do you put them together? Both contribute. And that's how I've answered a lot of the criticisms from both sides on that both groups, and I count myself as both, taxpayer and a transit rider, both groups are contributing to try to solve the issue at the TTC. So and hopefully we will continue to have sustainable service so that people can get around in our community, because not everybody drives. And you know what? Some people take it for really good reasons, including the environment and for convenience. But comments such as yours are forefront as I work through this, because our constituents are in this room and everyone's thinking, what is in it for us? You're asking us to pay more. And I agree. And you should be judging us because of that.
Thank you, Councillor Holyday. I'm just mindful of time, and I'm just going to give everybody a heads up that it looks like we might go 5 to 10 minutes behind schedule. We want to hear from all the folks who stood, of course, and came to participate. So thank you in advance. Go ahead.
We're just going to go online and then we'll go right back to the slide.
Yeah, I apologize to Andy. I accidentally skipped his question. He was wondering how much revenue did the community speed radar camera program and red light cameras generate last year, and what is the projected revenue for 2023?
I don't have the total revenue. I have the incremental increase. I believe this year we're expecting, it was somewhere around 8 to 10 million in additional revenue that we were expecting to generate, and that revenue is going to offset added costs that we would have to deliver the services within court services, but also transportation services. But it did generate a net revenue. And again, I think it's in and around that range in terms of a net revenue.
Okay, I'll be fast. Hi, thank you for having me. My name is Laura Lindberg. I am in the wonderful Ward 2. So thank you very much to both councillors for holding this event. So that's my first thing, is a huge thank you, and thank you to city staff, because these kinds of town halls are so critical. So I really encourage you to keep doing this, and I'll keep coming out. But my question is,
we missed them because of COVID. We missed them.
That's true.
Thank you for coming.
My question is this. I would love to see a side-by-side of Transform TO, what was all required for Transform TO, the important climate strategy for this great city of Toronto, and what is in the budget. It's 17 billion is a big number, but it's easy to kind of mask things in all these big numbers. What I'd love to know is, we were going to buy in 2023 this many electric buses, and in 2024 this many, and 2020, and this budget has money for this many. So where are the gaps? And then we can, figure out how to fill those gaps. I'm going to take just a couple words from your presentation, which was great. Accountability and transparency. I'd love the city to be more transparent on our climate investments. So I want to know that we are really funding them. And on the 7%, that hurts. But if this 7% could go toward funding climate actions and toward a more climate safe and just city, I'd put my 7% on the table.
Thank you very much for those comments. I don't know that we have the sort of side-by-side information right now for the Transform TO program, but I do trust that I can work with Councillor Holyday's office and my team to get you some information that you can dig into a little bit more. And that's exactly what we're trying to do right now. So our incredible staff have done a presentation to council, and the budget committee is going through, right? And each division by division and project by project, we're able to analyze and to ask specific questions and request briefing notes of staff to really fully understand what the implications are. Are there violent crime implications with the police increase, or is it just the response time, right? So us really being able to get into the weeds so that we can understand these things and hold folks to account, right? Make sure that we're holding ourselves accountable to our commitments, but also identifying if there are important gap areas that we're missing right now on these priorities, whether it's homelessness or climate, that we can bring that forward, right, as part of this agenda process, this budget process, to make sure that it is on the agenda and that it's top of mind for folks. And Councillor Holyday, please.
Transform TO is an enormous body of work of enormous importance that points to a profoundly different world in the future. I think, though, one thing that it's important not to miss is the city may have a bunch of jobs that it has to do. Buy electric buses, right? Lots of money, but that's just buses. The entire success of the plan is relying on the shoulders of all of the citizens and all of the things that we, count myself in, I'm a citizen, are going to have to do to change our world and our lives. And it's going to cost a lot of money. Two main factors in Transform TO: electrifying transportation and electrifying homes and heating, right? Those are the two big sources. Well, the city's not going to buy an electric car. You're going to have to make that investment in time. And I'm pretty sure the city's not going to come and insulate your house and change your furnace to an electric one. You're going to have to do that. So some of the operative words inside the Transform TO plan is incentive and disincentive. Let you take away and think about those. But they are something that I would encourage people, never mind the city budget, think about your own and what you're going to need to do over the decades to make a difference. No one's going to do it for you. And that is, part of our responsibility as citizens. And there are varying degrees of opinion on this and varying degrees of opinion about what's important and what needs to be done first. But there is a framework and a pathway there. And the city is thinking about the profound things that need to be stepped through. A simple one. Where's all the electricity going to come to make all of this happen? Well, you can pay for it. That's, that's part of it. But actually building it and making it work is a very complex process over the decades. You think there's construction now, think about what else has to be done to get those wires going and reliability, because we'll all live in buildings that if the lights go out, the heat stops at the same time too. So, a very different future, but, it responds to what this planet needs. So we will be on that journey together. And if you don't know a lot about it, I encourage you to read up on it, even generically, not just the city's plan, but we all have to be thinking about this ourselves in our own lives. Thank you.
So my name is Amber Lee, and I guess by background I'm in spiritual care and a bit of a theological background. So principles of human dignity matter quite a bit to me. I volunteer my time in an advocacy center frequently, and the reason I came was to learn a little bit more about the budget, particularly EPIC. And my question was around how to obtain further details on the program. Largely what we have happening in the advocacy office frequently are a number of people who are unhoused and a tremendous uptake in not being even able to obtain them a shelter bed. They happen to be going in the same type of cycle that's very reoccurring. They, for whatever reason, stayed in an apartment, a unit, someplace they were living for a very long period of time, some like 10 years plus, and then their rent did not increase at the pace of the market. A number of them dealing with either disability issues, addiction issues, or mental health were not able to deal with their landlord successfully in fighting things that were minuscule or diversive just to remove them from their unit, it would appear, so that they can obtain someone else in the unit who's going to pay considerably more. So the reasons that I want to know further details around EPIC is what is going to be going into that program to help minimize that. And as much as we're caring about homelessness, if there was a bit of a plug placed into preventing the drain of people who are on a margin of some kind from losing their housing just by victim of being there too long and being in a lower rent position for the market, that's unfortunate. So I'd like to know a little bit more about what's contained in EPIC and how to obtain that info. There's one other thing that I do have to say because of who I am. Okay. I don't know this gentleman, John, but I felt that was all manner of rude, what happened earlier today. And so I applaud the room for clapping him off because I found it concerning when he indicated, first, I'm also going to share, I'm not particularly in favor of changing the name Dundas. I'm not against it, but I'm not overly in favor of it. And so if his wife is not in favor of it, that does not make her racist. But the behavior that you distributed here, where it seemed like you almost wanted to attack the only person of color on the panel, might not be behavior you would reference your wife to emulate, to not have that type of accusation in the future. There ends my comments though. But I genuinely do wish to know more about EPIC.
Absolutely.
And if someone wants to provide me information so I could learn more about what's in there that might help people, particularly in the advocacy office I'm serving in, that would be great.
Thank you so much for your question. Thank you for your service and the great work that you do.
She's not my wife.
So it's his sister he was referring to?
My sister.
Yeah.
She's been in politics.
Thank you for your comments and your question, Amberly. What I'll just say is, for those who aren't aware, the EPIC program is an eviction prevention program that the city runs. And just for my part, I actually am not sure, and Mr. Conforti, I don't know if you can speak to how much is allocated in the budget specific to that program.
I can't think off the top of my head the base amount, but I do know that we've added $1 million to the program this year, and that's on top of additions that we've made over the last couple of years.
Yeah, wonderful. So there are a few extra $1 million, and thank you, Matt. I see you over there giving a card, so we'll follow up with you for sure online, offline, so we can have a direct conversation. But that is actually an area of interest for me personally, and it is something that I've been trying to advance in terms of seeing how we can put some little additional supports to the EPIC program, because we understand the risk of homelessness is as large of an issue right now as homelessness itself. And when we're struggling with affordable units and supportive housing for folks on the margins, we understand that we need to keep more folks housed so that problem does not continue to grow. So I really appreciate your comments and I really appreciate your support. Unfortunately, the reality, being a racialized person in the world, is you're not always recognized for the fullness of your humanity or your experiences. But this is the world we navigate, and we're happy to be here. Anybody else want to make any comments? Seeing none, thanks again, Amberly, for your question. Turning it back over to gentleman at the front. Thank you.
All right, thank you. My name is Thaddeus Sherlock. I'm a private resident, a citizen of Long Branch. While Councillor Holyday, I'm sure you can speak to my comments in a particular way, being on the board of the TTC. All councillors are welcome to respond. And by the way, Councillor Morley, congratulations on your election. I hope for you a long, prosperous time on council. Nonetheless, is there any way the Toronto Transit Commission can explore the restoration of a private sector arm? Its antecedents, probably around 100 years ago or more, have had that sort of basis, and you can see this a lot in transit systems abroad, such as Hong Kong's transit system. I find a particular good case study in that it owns a lot of private land adjacent to its stations and makes quite a profit from it. But nonetheless, I think that naturally this sort of private motivation would entail the construction of dense, lush, transit-oriented communities that not only incentivize good usage of the transit system, I would say higher minimum baseline than present, but would also lead to a vitalized city, good city life. My point here being that I think a 6-minute best subway service baseline and reduced bus service would only be a disservice to transit riders everywhere, not only in the city, but in adjacent regions. Typically, the defunding and or loss of service in transit creates a negative feedback loop because fewer people will ride it. But I think private land use, the TTC being a landlord of sorts, would incentivize, being able to build these like larger communities, apartments, stores, what have you. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought.
That's okay. We can speak to some of the pieces that you raised so far, and thank you for coming down to share. The one thing that I'll just kind of highlight, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Councillor Holyday, who probably has a better handle on this piece than I do. But just as it relates to the partnership and the land opportunity, we do have Housing Now site at the Islington Station area. So we're going to actually be relocating Islington Station just slightly so that we can fit 3 or 4 large towers on that particular piece of land. And that's a project that the city is going to be stewarding as part of our Housing Now project. And hopefully, to your point about transit-oriented communities and the accessibility of that, and getting more folks out of cars, which is our ultimate goal as well, I think for the future is going to be really helpful. But I'll turn it over to my colleague, and if you're back on your train of thought, feel free to share some more.
Yep. Thank you. Point well taken. And thank you to Councillor Morley for that lead-in. In fact, that's right. There is active pursuit of the development of transit lanes. And I mean, there's some just right over here at Bloor and Islington. It's just that it hasn't, the shovel's not in the ground yet. And they're not formally transit-oriented communities, but focus on density is occurring on places like Eglinton Avenue, where there is future mass transit. There's tunnel boring machines moving along right now. And, people are thinking of the future there. And some of those developments in the heart of Ward 2 have been controversial because people have said, why? Why here? Why more apartment buildings along this stretch? Because the answer is there's going to be a subway station walking distance from it. And you have to pick a place to put the development. Do you kind of scatter it all over the place, or do you organize it? And I think most people understand that eventually. And maybe just the last point on there is, there's no joy in no one is smiling about reductions in service hours in the last budget. But I think the big piece, and I spoke to it, is that the ridership is so far down. How do you sustain the pre-COVID amounts of service? If it's, forgive me, if it's 60 or 68% of what it was, and the profile has changed because you're not having the Monday to Friday mass commuters that move through the system every week. It's a different profile of ridership, and it's very hard. And I think what you see with this budget, and again, I'm giving you a sort of a political lens on it, not the staff lens, is a balancing of many, many contributions to try to make it work. Some reductions, some raises in transit fare, and some increases in property tax revenue transfer to try to make it all fit together with the hope that more are coming. But the point's not lost, right? That, less service makes it less attractive, more crowding makes it less attractive, and I get it. And I really do appreciate the comment. So thank you.
Of course, if I may finish the rest of my sentence. This sort of shortfall of service precedent is something that I think is unamenable to the population. Also, I don't think the 6-minute best subway situation should be one we should have not gotten to, because this will not only gum up and encumber trips that need 2+ transfers, but also I think that this sort of real estate utilization will allow us to be in a place where we are not, I also would not have to resort to security theater pertaining to the hiring of more TTC security that would in effect harass unhoused people, and given the correlation between indigeneity and homelessness, violate Indigenous treaty rights in the city. On another note, just last question because I'm taking a bit of a while. Will the Toronto Parking Authority explore the retrofitting of parking meters with bi-directional chargers? I see a good potential in EV parking as a revenue tool, but also a good ability to contribute to the electrical grid. I see this as an advantage over the wheeled paper plates that are internal combustion engine automobiles, but I think it could be a good idea. Thank you.
I think you've got a lot of good things brewing there, and I really appreciate you sharing them. Thank you for participating today, and we'll definitely bring that note back around the opportunity around the EV station. I'm just going to break a couple of hearts here. The gentleman in front of me is going to be our last speaker. Just because we are so far over time, I really want to be respectful of everyone's time, including my colleagues here and those online and my staff who've been working since 8 a.m. So thank you so much, and I'll stick around afterwards, and I'm happy to have some one-on-one conversations if that's helpful for those of you who still wanted to comment. And of course, we'll provide information for you to weigh in with the budget committee. Go ahead, the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. Thanks for the great presentation, Mr. Conforti. Thank you for both attending. Just a bit of feedback. I prefer to spend the Dundas money on the underprivileged the hungry, the youth, the homeless, and so forth. Stephen, you mentioned the 7% is hard to swallow. I would say that was much harder to swallow is the last 8 years of being undertaxed and leaving us short in so many ways, so much backlog in infrastructure and maintenance and so forth. My question is, do you really think that cutting development charges will make housing more affordable? Because the basic principle in housing, unfortunately, is to maximize profits, not maximize unit sales. And we can do a lot more regulation, better rent controls, better land taxes, all sorts of rules to get the price of housing down. A lot of, I believe the city's been advocating working on inclusionary zoning, which also helps keep the price of land down. So anyways, that's basically a falsehood that's been presented in the report and presented by the building industry. As far as I know in economics, it's an absolute certainty, but I just wondered what your opinions on reducing development charges was as a actual measure to reduce the price of housing. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much for the question. I'm still pretty new here, but thank you for your comments. I do appreciate that input and your feedback. As it relates to development charges, my understanding is that it will not result in any additional affordability to housing. I think it will result in a less cost to the developers themselves, but I don't see that being passed off to owners. And frankly, as we've talked about and has been highlighted through this presentation, it really kneecaps the city and limits our ability to build the necessary and important infrastructure that comes along with that development. And so I'm very concerned about this, and I do not think that it's good legislation.
I'm pretty sure that's what the staff report also advised council. So there's, if you're interested in this, there is a really good staff report on Bill 23, if I remember my number right. There's so many of them these days. But you can go read some of the dynamics, but I think the language was along the lines, there weren't mechanisms that assured the savings would be passed on to consumers. It wasn't council's experiment on it. It's something that we have to live with. And I talked a little bit about the risks before about having money for infrastructure. Those questions are still hanging out there, but very much a going concern, regardless of what your philosophical approach is to development. If that money isn't made up somehow, it's passed on to property taxpayers and really even people that rent. If you're not an owner, that still finds the way out of your pocket. So as I said before, there's no free lunch. It's a zero sum. The money has to come from somewhere to provide the infrastructure for all of the new people. So definitely a concern, and it's built in little pieces inside this budget. And it's something that, we will all go through over the next number of years as we see our world change around us and how finances work. Thank you.
I would like to invite my colleague, Councillor Holyday, for closing remarks for this evening.
Just a really big thank you for everybody. I know it's been a long meeting and a few had to slip out, but people have been here for a long time. I'm not shy. My opinions will stick around for a little bit. If you want to ask me about how I feel about something, please, by all means, ask. I'm here. And if you don't do it tonight, send a note to my office, give a call. That's what we're here for. I really do rely on speaking to people. And this is a great chance to connect with a lot of people in the community. And as I said before, there's comments made, and even the questions that you ask help inform me about what's on your mind. And that helps me tremendously as I go through the council process and cast votes on your behalf. You've trusted me to do that. And, I will do my best. But if you have a burning question on something, or you want to let me know something, there's a variety of ways to do it. So don't think tonight's the only way, but please do take the time to do it. And I bid you all a very good night. Thank you.
I just want to echo those comments. Our gratitude to all of you for taking the time out and being here with us today. Of course, a major thank you and big round of applause for Mr. Conforti for his work. and Mike in the back on AV, and Sam over here with support. Thank you all so much. I think we have a little bit of snacks and some refreshments. I will stick around in the lobby area. I know Councillor Holyday is committed to sticking around for a few minutes as well. We do need to clear this room so staff can sort of do their tear down and get out of here at a reasonable time. But we'd love for you to take some snacks, grab a coffee. I know it's late in the evening now, but really just grateful for all of you. And please be in touch. You know, our offices are available. Councillor_Morley at toronto.ca. Councillor_Holyday at toronto.ca. We are at your service. Thank you so much.